Okay, continuing on with our discussion talking about transports and passengers, when it comes to unloading, unloading is pretty much the reverse of loading that we discussed in the previous video. Now, keep in mind before we get into the rest of it that, like I stated in the previous video, the act of loading and unloading does count as movement, which makes it subjectable to opportunity fire. So keep that in mind with everything we're discussing here. So just like when we were discussing with loading, with unloading, the transport again has the opportunity to move up to half its movement points, or it can unload directly into its hex. So as an example, we've got our M113 again, and these infantry, we're going to say, are the passengers inside of it. This M113, if these infantry were loaded in it, could unload the infantry directly into the hex that they were in, or move up to half its movement points and then unload them either into its hex or one of the surrounding adjacent hexes. So if the transport takes and unloads the infantry into its own hex or into an adjacent hex, then the infantry are going to be marked ops complete at that point. You do have the opportunity to unload into a enemy controlled hex, but we'll discuss that here in just a second. So just to show a couple of quick examples, let's say our infantry here unloaded into the hex that the M113 was in. They would be marked as ops complete. And at that point, the M113 still has the opportunity to spend up to half its movement points, and it could continue to move along. So you can spend those half movement points either before or after you unload the units. And like I said, another example, instead of the hex that they're in, you could move up to half the movement points and then unload them either into the hex that you stop in or a surrounding adjacent hex, including an enemy held hex, but that's going to be handled just a little differently considering that's an assault. So one of the things you do have the option of doing, like I said, is moving up to half your movement points and then unloading your passengers into an adjacent hex that does contain an enemy. Now remember before, like I said, the act of unloading does trigger opportunity fire, so these units could be opportunity fired at by eligible enemy units, and on the off chance that they are not disrupted by the attack, then they would be unloaded into the hex and conduct their assault as normally. If they are disrupted though, they will be left in the hex of the unloading unit, the transporting unit. Something else you can do as a transport is, let's say we have double the transport and double the passengers. So we have two M113s and two passengers. They could move both together while they are stacked together and then unload both of their passengers into the same enemy controlled hex to perform an assault. So there would be two infantry units performing the assault in that case, but again, they would both be subjectable to opportunity fire. And one of the things you have to keep in mind is that stacking limits are going to apply. So let's say that we did have two M113s and two infantry, and one of the infantry becomes disrupted and has to remain in this hex. That would violate the stacking limits, and the infantry would be eliminated at that point if they violate those stacking limits. Also, the act of unloading into an assault is something that is conducted by a ground transport unit. You do not have helicopters who are conducting the unload into an assault.